The dining room of Aubergine smelled like money, not the crass, obvious kind, but the slow, aged sort that had been marinating in mahogany panels and burgundy wine for decades. Cora Prentiss moved through it the way she had learned to move through everything difficult in her life. Quietly, precisely, and without drawing attention to herself. She carried a decanter of 2009 Chateau Pichon Baron to table 14 with both hands, the way Chef Marchand had taught her on her first shift, the weight of the bottle balanced against her palm, her wrist perfectly still. Around her, the low murmur of conversation rose and fell like something breathing. Crystal caught the candlelight. A woman at table 8 laughed softly at something her companion said, and the sound dissolved into the general hum of a room that cost most people's monthly salary just to enter. Cora set the decanter down without a sound and stepped back. She was 28 years old. She had $47 in her checking account, a biochemistry textbook she could no longer afford to replace, and a mother whose dialysis appointments ran 3 times a week on the other side of the city. She had been a waitress at Aubergine for 2 years and 4 months. She had learned, in that time, exactly how to be invisible. Most nights, invisible was the best thing to be. The reservation for table 6 had come in under the name Whitmore and Associates. A corporate booking, 12 guests, the private alcove that required 48 hours' notice, and a deposit that would have covered 2 months of Cora's rent. The host, Simone, had briefed the floor staff before service. One of the guests was Prescott Hayden, the founder and CEO of Hayden Capital, a private equity firm that had absorbed 4 regional hospital systems in the last 3 years, and restructured each one the same way, closed the unprofitable wings, renegotiated the nursing contracts, installed administrators whose primary credential was loyalty. He was, by most accounts, extremely wealthy and completely aware of it. Cora had nodded during the briefing. She had noted the name. She had gone back to polishing glassware. She was not thinking about Prescott Hayden when she approached table 6 at 7:43 to take the first drink order. She was thinking about whether she had remembered to move her mother's Thursday appointment, and whether the pharmacy on Delancey would still have the prescription waiting, and whether she had enough left on her transit card to get across town after her shift ended. These were the things that lived in the front of her mind most evenings, the logistics of a life held together with careful math and careful silence. "Sparkling or still to start?" she asked, and her voice came out the way it always did on the floor, calm, unhurried, professionally warm. The man at the head of the table glanced up at her the way he might glance at a piece of furniture he hadn't noticed before, a brief, dismissive flicker of acknowledgement. Prescott Hayden was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and now had simply become authoritative. His jaw was set. His suit was dark and expensive and fit him the way expensive suits fit men who had been measured many times. He had the particular ease of someone who had not waited for anything in a very long time. "Still," he said, without looking at her again. Then, to the man beside him, stocky, silver-templed, the name Crenshaw on the reservation, some kind of associate, he continued without pause. "The Meridian deal closes Friday. Their board doesn't have the leverage they think they have." Cora moved to the next guest. She took orders. She recorded them in the small leather notebook Aubergine required its servers to use. No electronic pads. The management felt it was more personal, and she moved on. It was not until the appetizer course that Prescott Hayden looked at her directly for the first time. She had brought the amuse-bouche herself, a small architectural thing involving compressed cucumber and a ribbon of creme fraiche, because Marco, the runner, had called out sick and they were short-staffed. She set the first plate in front of the guest to Hayden's left, then moved to his right, then reached across to set the plate in front of him. "You've brought the wrong amuse," he said. Cora paused. "I'm sorry?" "The cucumber." He tilted his head toward the plate with a barely perceptible disdain. "I have a cucumber intolerance. It was noted in the reservation." Cora's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She checked the mental map she'd been running all evening. 12 guests, their orders, their notes, cross-referenced against the reservation printout Simone had handed her before service. The reservation notes she had reviewed carefully had indicated one guest with a shellfish allergy, Conrad Bay, table position 4, and one guest, Hayden himself, who had requested in the comments field, no cucumber, preference for leaner protein presentations. She had flagged it to the kitchen. She had specifically flagged it. She looked down at the plate in front of Prescott Hayden. The cucumber was there. "I'll have that corrected immediately," she said. "You should have caught it before it reached the table. You're right. I apologize." She lifted the plate and walked toward the kitchen with the measured, unhurried pace that aubergine required. No running, no visible stress, and as soon as she was through the service door, she let out a single, controlled breath. The kitchen was loud, heat-edged, and smelled of reduced stock and butter. She handed the plate back to the line and told them quietly, and the correction was made. She stood for exactly 12 seconds. Then she straightened her shoulders, picked up the corrected plate, and walked back out. She did not let herself think about how tired she was. She did not let herself think about the 3-hour shift she still had ahead, or the bus ride after, or the fact that she had eaten nothing since noon except a piece of bread she'd taken from the staff tray during the 5-minute lull between the 4 o'clock setup and the 6 o'clock doors. She thought about the placement of her feet, the angle of the tray, the distance to the table. She set the corrected plate in front of Prescott Hayden. He did not acknowledge it. Crenshaw, across the table, caught her eye and gave her a small, apologetic look. Cora returned it with a neutral smile and moved on. She had learned, in 2 years and 4 months, that some tables operated on a specific social physics. The person with the most power in the room needed the most management, and management meant being invisible in all the ways they wanted, and visible in all the ways they required. Hayden wanted her quick, accurate, and silent. She could do quick, accurate, and silent. She had spent most of her adult life practicing it. What she could not predict, and had not anticipated, was the way the evening would shift after the entree course. She had returned to the alcove to pour the second bottle of wine, a 2015 Barolo, that the table had ordered with the mains, when she caught it. Not a full sentence. A fragment, low-toned, tilted in the direction of the silver-haired woman to Hayden's left, whose name on the reservation read Dr. Anneliese Breck, and who had spent most of the dinner looking at her phone. "Sicut ancilla," Hayden was saying, and he half smiled. The kind of smile that required an audience, even a small one. Cora's hand did not stop moving. The wine continued to pour. Her face remained exactly as it was. But something in her went very, very still, sicut ancilla, like a servant. Or, more specifically, in the older register Hayden had used, the connotation wasn't simply servant, it was something closer to bondwoman, a word that carried the entire weight of Roman social hierarchy, condensed and precise, and delivered in the perfect register of someone who expected to be the only person at the table who understood it. Dr. Breck gave a soft, flat laugh, the kind that wasn't amusement so much as acknowledgement, and looked back at her phone. Cora finished pouring the Barolo and stepped back. She knew Latin. She had studied it for 3 years at Belhaven University, where she'd been on a full academic scholarship, biochemistry major with a second area of study in classical languages. a combination that had confused her advisor and delighted the dean of the Humanities College, who had called her linguistic competencies, in a letter she'd kept in a drawer for 6 years, genuinely exceptional. She had taken Latin because she had loved it, because the precision of it appealed to the same part of her brain that found organic chemistry satisfying, the way every component had a function, the way nothing was arbitrary. She had read Cicero in the original. She had translated Seneca for a seminar paper that her professor had submitted to an undergraduate journal, without telling her. She had left Belhaven at the start of her junior year, when her mother's kidneys failed. She had not gone back. She set the bottle of Barolo on the table's service station and moved on to the next task. Cora had long since made peace, or something that functioned like peace, with the shape her life had taken. The scholarship money had been refunded in part, and she'd used it for the first round of medical bills. The rest had come from shifts, catering first, then a diner on Amsterdam Avenue, then, through a stroke of timing and a reference from a culinary instructor she'd taken one class from, aubergine. The money here was better, the environment was harder to move through, but she had learned the physics of it, and most nights she could navigate it without incident. Most nights did not include Prescott Hayden. The main course moved forward. Cora managed the table with the careful coordination that 12 covers in a private alcove required, tracking each plate, each dietary note, each empty glass. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The same capacity that had let her hold 3 simultaneous hypotheses in her head during a biochemistry exam now let her hold 12 individual guests, their preferences, their pacing, and their moods, in a kind of continuous peripheral awareness. She was collecting the entree plates when it happened the second time. Hayden was speaking again, lower this time, his voice pitched in the particular way of someone who knows they're being overheard and has decided they don't care. The woman to his right, younger, someone's associate, name unknown, was smiling at something he'd said. And then he glanced up at Cora, directly, with a gaze that was not hostile, so much as simply indifferent, and he said, in the same clean, unhurried Latin, "Vidne quid aliud agatquam quod dubia." See to it that she does nothing except what she is told. It was not said to Cora. It was said over her, the way you might comment on the operation of a piece of equipment. There was no malice in it, exactly. It was something worse than malice. It was the complete and total absence of the possibility that she might understand. Cora lifted the last plate from the table, straightened, and looked at Prescott Hayden for a long, flat moment. He was already looking away. She walked back to the service station. She set the plate down. She stood with her, back to the dining room for 3 seconds, looking at the wall. She thought about her mother, who had been a school teacher for 31 years and who spent 3 mornings a week in a plastic chair with a needle in her arm, reading paperback mysteries because she had refused to let Cora sit with her during the treatments. "You have a shift," her mother always said. "Go to your shift." She thought about the textbook she'd had to sell back at the start of last semester, when she'd been trying, very briefly, to take a night class at the community college, just to keep the language current, just to keep her mind from going quiet in the places it used to be loud. She thought about the scholarship letter in her drawer, the one she hadn't been able to throw away even when she'd moved apartments twice and donated most of what she owned. Genuinely exceptional, she picked up the dessert menus. She squared her shoulders. She walked back to table 6. The rest of the dessert course passed in the ordinary rhythm of service. Hayden ordered the cheese plate, then changed his mind to the chocolate preparation, then changed his mind again. Cora recorded each change without comment. She brought the final course. She refreshed the water. She answered a question from Crenshaw, about the provenance of the cheese, with accurate, concise information that she could provide because she had memorized the entire cheese program when she'd first started at Aubergine, the way she memorized everything she was given, completely, without effort, which had sometimes felt like a gift and sometimes felt like a taunt. The table was moving toward its close. Hayden's conversation had shifted to something about a regulatory meeting in Washington, and the energy in the alcove had the looser, settling quality of people who have eaten well and are almost ready to leave. Cora began the final calculations in her mind, the check, the timing, whether to present it to Hayden or Crenshaw, the note she needed to leave for the closing server. And then Hayden looked at Dr. Breck and said, almost idly, his voice carrying the faint, satisfied quality of a man who is comfortable in every room he enters, quod non intelligent, laudant. What they do not understand, they praise. He was not looking at Cora. He was looking at some middle distance that encompassed the room, the service, the general apparatus of people who worked for him, or near him, or beneath him. But she was the only staff member in the alcove at that moment, and the sentence landed where it was always going to land. Cora was standing 3 feet to his left, holding a folded linen napkin that a guest had dropped. She looked at Prescott Hayden. He finally glanced back at her, almost as an afterthought, and in that glance there was the precise expression she had seen on a dozen faces like his, the mild, uninquisitive certainty that the person in front of him registered nothing. She said, very quietly, in Latin so clean and so unhurried that it landed in the silence of the alcove like a stone dropped into still water. Nusquam es qui ubic est, Domine. He who is everywhere is nowhere, sir. It was Seneca, the first letter to Lucilius. She had not chosen it for any particular strategic reason. It had arrived, the way the right sentence sometimes does, from somewhere below conscious thought. But it was the right sentence because it was precise in the way that Prescott Hayden claimed to value precision, and because it was correct in a register that went several centuries deeper than his, and because the Domine, the Sir, was faultlessly polite in a way that left no room to object, while also being, in context, an almost surgical containment of everything he'd said in the last 2 hours. The alcove went quiet in a way that was different from its previous quiet. Dr. Breck looked up from her phone. Crenshaw set his glass down. Prescott Hayden stared at Cora. She returned his gaze with the same measured, professionally composed expression she had worn all evening. Her hands were perfectly still. The linen napkin rested in her palm without trembling. What crossed Hayden's face in the following 4 seconds was not embarrassment exactly. A man like Prescott Hayden had built too many walls for simple embarrassment, but something more like the sensation of a floor failing to be where he had expected it. The certainty that had structured his entire evening, perhaps a significant portion of his adult life, had just been interrupted by a woman in a restaurant apron who had quoted Seneca back at him with native-level accuracy and the composure of someone who had nothing left to prove. "You," he started. "Can I bring anything else to the table this evening?" Cora asked. Her voice was exactly what it had been all night, calm, unhurried, professionally warm. The silence stretched another beat. Crenshaw gave a small, involuntary sound that was not quite a laugh. The woman to Hayden's right looked between the two of them with the expression of someone watching a situation they had not been briefed on. Dr. Breck was looking at Cora with an expression that was considerably more interested than anything she'd shown over the preceding 3 hours of dinner. Hayden said nothing. His jaw had tightened. The particular set of his face, that authoritative, settled confidence, had been replaced by something tighter and less certain, like a door that no longer fit its frame. "The check," he said, finally. "Just bring the check." Cora nodded once. Of course. She walked back to the service station. She printed the check. She placed it in the leather folder that Aubergine used and walked it back to the table and set it in front of Hayden and stepped back and waited with the quiet, practiced patience that she had been practicing for years before she ever set foot in this restaurant. She was thinking about Seneca again. Not the quote, but the fact of it. The fact that she had read him at 19, sitting in the library stacks at Belhaven, with her feet up on the shelf and a thermos of bad coffee, reading in Latin for pleasure, reading because the language arranged, thought in a way that felt like architecture, and she had written in the margin next to that line, she could still see her own handwriting, the particular cramped cursive of someone taking notes fast. This is the truest thing. She had written that. She had been 19. She had believed, in the way you believe things at 19, before the shape of your life becomes apparent, that she would spend decades with these texts. She had not spent decades with them. But she had not lost them, either. That was the thing she hadn't fully understood until this moment. The years had taken a great deal from her. The degree, the scholarship, the version of her future that had seemed, at 19, essentially guaranteed. But they had not taken the knowledge itself. The Latin had stayed, the biochemistry had stayed, encoded somewhere she couldn't see, ready when she needed it. The capacity that the Dean of the Humanities College had called genuinely exceptional had not gone anywhere. It had simply been waiting, in the way water waits behind a dam, with no particular urgency and no particular resentment, until the moment when it was needed. The check came back signed. The table began to gather itself. Hayden stood without looking at her. But Crenshaw paused on his way past the service station, and he turned to Cora with an expression that was somewhere between respect and something more complicated. "Belhaven?" he asked. She looked at him. "Your Latin," he said. "It's very specific, formal but not stiff. The Stoics, if I had to guess. I studied at Belhaven myself. 20 years ago, we had a professor, Delacroix. You wouldn't know her. She retired. Dr. Delacroix taught me to read Seneca," Cora said. Crenshaw went still. "Recede in te ipse," he said quietly. It was the same letter. The second line, "retreat into yourself." "Quantum potes," she finished. "As much as you can." He looked at her for a long moment, not the way Hayden had looked at her, not the unseeing, assessing look of someone categorizing a service worker, but the look of someone recognizing something real. "What's your name?" he asked. "Cora Prentiss. Crenshaw," he said, though she already knew. "Aldous Crenshaw. I'm the chief academic officer at Belhaven." He paused. "We have a re-enrollment office." Cora's throat did something she didn't expect. She pressed it flat. "I know," she said. "I've looked at it. There are completion grants," he said, "for students who had to leave for financial reasons, specifically for students who had to leave for medical reasons in their families. The program is new, this academic year. It's not widely publicized yet." He reached into his jacket and produced a card, plain white, clean type. He set it on the service station beside her notepad. "Call the number on the back. Tell them I sent you." That's a direct line to the director. Cora looked at the card. She had not cried at work in 2 years and 4 months of working at Aubergine. She had not cried at the cucumber error or the third Latin insult or any of the dozen small indignities that a restaurant floor accumulated on a busy Saturday. She was not going to cry now. She picked up the card. "Thank you," she said. Crenshaw nodded. He started to go, then paused once more. "For what it's worth," he said, and there was something wry in it, something that suggested he had worked alongside Prescott Hayden long enough to know precisely what it was worth. Seneca was the right choice. She allowed herself one small, real smile. "He usually is," she said. After the table cleared, Cora finished her closing work alone, the way she always did. reset the alcove, confirmed the inventory with the bar, processed the remaining side work that the short staff had left behind. She moved through it with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and when it was done, she put on her coat in the back room and tucked the white card into the inside pocket where she kept her transit card. And her phone. The kitchen was shutting down. Chef Marchand was doing his final walkthrough. One of the line cooks had a radio going at low volume, something slow and indistinct. The smell of the place at close was different from the smell at open, deeper, more mineral, the specific exhaustion of a kitchen that had fed 200 people and was now becoming a room again. Cora put on her scarf and walked out through the back. The city was cold and bright and fully itself, indifferent to her in all the usual ways, and she walked toward the bus stop with her hands in her pockets and the white card pressed against her chest. She thought about calling her mother, but it was after 11, and her mother would be asleep. She would call in the morning. She would tell her about the card. She would probably not tell her about Prescott Hayden and the Latin. Her mother would laugh, and then she would worry, and the worry would take longer to dissolve than the laughter, and there wasn't time for that. There was the bus. There was the card. There was the number on the back, which she would call on Monday, which was her day off, which she would spend in the morning at her mother's apartment, sitting in the chair in the corner of the dialysis room that her mother kept telling her not to sit in. And reading, because there was always something to read, and because her mother, despite everything, had never once stopped bringing books to her appointments. The bus came. Cora got on. She found a seat near the back window and watched the city unreal behind the glass, the lit windows, and the dark storefronts, and the particular amber of the streetlights at this hour. She thought about Seneca. She thought about Dr. Delacroix, who had retired but whose voice she could still hear when she read the letters. Precise, slightly impatient, profoundly kind. She thought about the stacks at Belhaven and the thermos of bad coffee, and her own handwriting in the margins of a text she no longer owned. This is the truest thing. She had not lost it. She had simply been carrying it somewhere no one had thought to look. In the hands that carried decanters, without spilling, in the memory that held 12 covers simultaneously, in the composure that did not break under the gaze of men who assumed that a woman in an apron had nothing behind her eyes. She had been carrying it through every shift, every bill, every 3 a.m. inventory of what she still had and what she'd given up, and it had stayed intact. It had stayed, and now it had arrived somewhere, in the way that things that survive long enough eventually do. The bus moved through the dark city, and Cora Prentiss rode it home, and for the first time in a very long time, she was thinking about what came next.